Okay, so you sent over something really interesting this week. It's an article by Sam Robertstad, Pivot, Persevere, or Kill a Feature from the Product Leaders Playbook over on LinkedIn.
Yes. Good one.
Yeah, it really gets into something we maybe don't talk about enough. That phase after the big launch, what happens when the feature you poured everything into, well, isn't quite hitting the mark you expected?
Exactly. The launch party's over, and now you've got the data. What do you do?
Right. So the big question is what's next? Our goal for this deep dive is basically to pull out the key ideas from Robert Stad's piece. We want to give everyone listening a solid way to think about making those tough calls without getting totally swamped by data.
It's such a critical point in the product life cycle. We love celebrating the launch, but the real work, the real test often comes later. Are we actually adding value? And if not, what's the plan? It's easy to just drift.
Okay, let's dig in. Robert Stad starts off by highlighting something he calls the hidden cost of indecision. It's not just about picking the next cool thing to build, is it?
Not at all. It's just as much about dealing with what you've already built, especially if it's underperforming.
Right. Facing the music, so to speak.
Precisely. Think about it. Every single feature you have out there needs something. It needs engineering time, maybe design tweaks, customer support knows about it. Even a feature hardly anyone uses can be a quiet drain on resources.
A drain.
Yeah. And some studies suggest teams can spend a pretty big chunk of their time, maybe like 20% or even more in some cases, just keeping these less than stellar features alive.
Wow, 20%. That's huge.
It is. That's time, energy, brain power that could be going towards the next big thing or fixing a critical issue. And the longer you wait to decide, the more those costs just pile up. You're missing opportunities.
Okay, so that really sets the stage. You're looking at this feature, it's not quite there. Robert Stad says there are basically three ways forward. First one, pivot. What does that actually mean?
Pivoting, it's basically saying, okay, the problem we thought users had, that's still real. People still feel that pain. But the solution we built, it's just not quite right. It's not resonating.
So you don't ditch the whole idea?
Not necessarily. You change the execution. You shift your approach to try and solve that same underlying need just differently.
Okay, like say you built a new kind of forum for a community, but nobody's using the threads. Pivoting might mean realizing they actually want live chat features instead. Same goal connection, but a different tool.
Exactly. The fundamental need is still there. You just miss the mark on the how, so you adjust.
Got it. Okay, option two Robert Stagg gives is persevere. When does that make sense? When do you stick with something that's kind of struggling?
Persevering is the choice when you see, well, glimmers of hope, maybe, even if the big numbers aren't amazing yet.
Glimmers like what?
Maybe you've got a small group of really enthusiastic users, even if it's niche. Their feedback is gold. Or you look at the trends, and key metrics are actually ticking upwards, slowly but surely.
Okay, an upward trend.
Yeah, or maybe you've actually identified why it's not taking off. Like the onboarding is confusing or it's technically slow. If you see clear, fixable problems that are likely holding it back, that's a reason to persevere. You believe you can fix it.
So it's like, okay, this isn't dead. It just needs some focused work. There's a path forward.
Right, there's reasoned optimism based on something concrete, not just wishful thinking.
Makes sense. Then there's the third one, often the hardest, I imagine. Kill. When does Robert Stad say you just have to pull the plug?
Yeah, this is tough. Killing a feature is the call when the evidence is pretty clear. It's not really solving a problem people care enough about, or the value it does provide just isn't worth the ongoing effort.
What does that look like in the data?
Consistently low usage is a big one. If hardly anyone's touching it month after month,
Yeah.
that's the sign. Also, user feedback, if it's mostly negative or worse, just indifferent. Nobody cares.
Indifference might be worse than hate sometimes.
It can be. And then there's the cost side. If the maintenance is a nightmare, tons of technical debt, constant bugs, it's an operational headache, and the value is tiny. The equation doesn't add up.
Robert Stad has that great line, something like, sometimes the most strategic move isn't pushing harder, it's letting go. That really hits home.
It does, and feels counterintuitive because you invested so much, right? Time, effort, maybe even team morale.
Yeah, the sunk cost fallacy.
Totally. But keeping a dying feature on life support has real consequences. It ties up your team, prevents them working on things that could be huge. You have to think about that opportunity cost. What amazing thing are we not building because we're propping this up?
Okay, so those are the three paths. Let's get more specific. What are the signs Robert Stad points to for when to pivot?
Okay, for pivoting, he lists a few things. One big signal is if your Qualitative feedback interviews, surveys confirms the user problem is definitely real and important, but people are just like, about your solution. They don't get it, or it doesn't quite fit their workflow.
So they have the problem, just not your answer to it.
Exactly. Another sign is if users seem confused or aren't engaging, but when you talk to them, they can clearly explain the need you were aiming for. And sometimes your initial guesses were just wrong, but you learn something really valuable that points to a different, better solution. That's pivot territory.
That qualitative stuff feels crucial, listening beyond the clicks.
Absolutely. The why behind the numbers.
Okay, what about persevering? What signs suggest it's worth sticking it out and putting more effort in?
For persevering, Robert Stad mentions looking for that upward trend in adoption or engagement, even if it's slow. Also, look at cohort analysis. Are the newer users sticking around better than the first wave? That might mean your recent fixes are working.
Ah, interesting. So improvement over time.
Right. And crucially, can you pinpoint specific friction points like the sign-up flow is clunky or it crashes on certain devices? If you have clear, solvable problems like that, fixing them might unlock growth.
Fixable friction. I like that.
And one more strategic alignment. If this feature, even if it's slow starting, is absolutely core to your long-term strategy or a critical user journey, you might need to invest more to make it work.
Okay, that makes sense. It's not just about this feature, but how it fits the bigger picture. Now, the tough one again, killing. What are the definitive signs? It's probably time to say goodbye.
Robert Stad is pretty direct here. Very low usage plus negative or, again, indifferent feedback. That's a bad combo.
Hard to argue with that.
Also, the maintenance cost. Is it sucking up way more engineering time, causing more bugs, or creating more support tickets than its value justifies? Is the technical debt crippling? That's a major factor.
The cost outweighs the benefit.
Clearly. And finally, the big strategic question. Is this feature actively blocking your team from pursuing something with much higher potential value? If resources tied up here are preventing you from seizing a bigger opportunity, that's a strong argument for killing it.
That idea of blocking progress is powerful. It's not just about the past investment, but the future potential you're sacrificing. Okay, so we understand the paths: pivot, persevere, kill. But how do we actually make the call? Robert Stad suggests some tools, right?
He does, yeah. He offers 3 practical ways to bring some structure to this to help get past the emotion and biases. First, revisit your RICE or ICE scoring, but post-launch.
Ah, using those prioritization scores again.
Exactly. RICE is reach, impact, confidence, effort. ICE is impact, confidence, ease. You probably used one of these before building. Now go back with real data. Was your estimated reach accurate? What's the actual impact? How confident are you now? How much effort is it really taking to maintain or improve? Rescoring forces that reality check.
That's clever. Confronting assumptions with facts using a familiar method. What's the second tool?
Second is what he calls the 3-question retrospective. It's designed to be quick, cross-functional, and focused. Just 3 questions for the team.
Okay, what are they?
1. What assumptions did we get right about this feature? 2. What outcomes did we actually drive, good and bad? And 3. If we could do it all over again, knowing what we know now, would we build it the same way?
I like how simple and direct that is. Gets right to the point, focuses on learning.
Yeah, it cuts through a lot of the noise.
And the third tool Robert Stad recommends?
The third one is opportunity cost mapping. This is about making the trade-offs really visual and explicit.
How do you do that?
You basically map out, what are we not doing because our resources, people, time, money, are tied up supporting this feature. List those other potential projects, those bug fixes, those explorations. Seeing it laid out makes the question sharper. Is keeping this feature alive worth more than pursuing these other things?
Wow, that makes the cost of inaction really tangible. It's not just an abstract concept anymore.
Exactly. It frames the decision around future value. Where can our efforts make the biggest difference next?
Okay, these tools sound really helpful. But there's another layer. Communicating the decision, especially if it's the kill decision. That can be tricky territory. Robert Stad talks about this too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Making the decision is one thing. Communicating it effectively, especially internally to the team that built it, and sometimes externally to users, is crucial and needs care.
So what's his advice there? How do you break the news?
Lead with the data. This is key. Show the numbers, the low usage, the negative feedback trends, the high maintenance cost. Ground the decision in objective reality. It makes it less about opinion and more about a logical conclusion.
Right, let the data tell the story. Less personal that way, maybe.
It helps. He also says to reframe it around opportunity. Don't just focus on what's ending. Talk about what this decision enables. By freeing up these resources, we can now focus on building X or tackling Y. Paint a picture of the positive future this unlocks.
Focus on the future gains.
Yes. And importantly, acknowledge the effort. Recognize the hard work the team put into the original feature. Validate their contribution and the good intentions, even if the outcome wasn't what was hoped. Then explain why the strategic direction needs to shift.
That acknowledgement feels really important for team morale. Show respect for the past work.
Definitely. And he has that fantastic quote you mentioned earlier.
Oh, yeah. Killing a feature isn't failure. It's focus.
Exactly. That's the mindset shift. If you handle the communication well, with data, empathy, and a focus on the future, Robert Stadt argues it can actually build trust. It shows you're making disciplined choices for the good of the product and the users.
That's a really powerful reframe. Focus, not failure. So wrapping things up, Robert Stadt's main point seems to be that this kind of tough prioritization doesn't stop at launch. It's ongoing.
Absolutely. It's a continuous process. He really hammers home that strategic clarity has to win out over just, keeping things going because they're already there. Reluctant momentum, he calls it.
Reluctant momentum. Love that term.
Yeah. Whether you pivot, persevere, or kill, the ultimate aim is always maximizing the value you deliver for your users and for the business. Making these hard calls is part of product leadership. It keeps the team focused and, honestly, keeps morale higher in the long run than letting things just flounder.
So the big takeaway for everyone listening, decisions after launch are just as vital, maybe even more so than the initial build decision. Use that pivot, persevere, or kill framework. Lean on tools like rescoring, the 3 questions, opportunity cost mapping, and communicate clearly.
It really boils down to strategic thinking and data-informed decision-making, constantly evaluating where your resources will have the greatest impact.
And like Robert Stadt says, strategic clarity beats reluctant momentum every time.
Well put.
All right, so here's a final thought to chew on, something to take away from this. Think about a feature you use all the time, or maybe one that disappeared recently. Knowing what we've discussed today from Robert Stadt's framework, would you have advised that product team to pivot, persevere, or kill it? What signs, even just from your user perspective, might have pointed one way or the other? Kind of a fun exercise to apply these ideas.
Definitely makes you look at apps differently.
It does. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.